Namaskar. Welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival 2023, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India, at Charbagh. We welcome you all. We're delighted to introduce the Bernardine Manifesto. Booker Prize winner Bernardine Evaristo's memoir, Manifesto on Never Giving Up, is an inspirational account of her life and career as she rebelled against the mainstream, fought over several decades to bring her creative work into the world. The powerful narrative takes us through her life while examining contemporary conversations around race, class, feminism, sexuality, and aging. In a session moderated by Nandini Nair, Evaristo presents her reimagined memoir and an essential manual for creativity, activism, and reinventions. Bernardine won the Booker Prize 2019 with her 8th book, Girl, Woman, Other, and became the first Black woman and Black British person to win that award. The recipient of many honors, including 2 recent British Book Awards, she was named Person of the Year by UK Bestseller magazine in 2021. We're very happy to have her amongst us. Bernardine, please come up on the stage. Nandini Nair has been a journalist for more than 15 years. She's the literary and cultural editor of Open Magazine. She has previously worked as a writer and commissioning editor in the features section of the Indian Express and the Hindu. So before we go on, may I request you to shuffle the seats, because we are live with an audience which already has your name tag on it. So, otherwise Nandini will be seen as Evaristo. Thank you so much. Please, Nandini, it's over to you.
Thank you so much for that. Bernardine, it's wonderful to have you in Jaipur. I reckon this is your first time. So I'm just going to plunge straight into the book and we'll take it from there. So for those of you who haven't yet read Manifesto as yet, just a very quick summary. It's about her life, about 4 decades of writing, of being in theater, of activism. The Booker, as some people wrongly said, it was an overnight success, but this book is about how it's been decades of toil and effort and hard work and of course brilliance. And I think the wonderful thing about this book is how for Bernardine, success can never be just at an individual level. It has to be sort of at a society level. So it's all about solidarity, it's all about sisterhood, it's about lifting each other up, because unless we lift each other up, then there's no point of individual success. The book has sort of 7 parts to it, and just to sort of briefly summarize, and these are your chapter names: there's family, there's homes, there's relationships, there's theater, there's writing, there's influences and activism. So I'm just going to sort of start off with a very general question. What prompted you to write a memoir after 4 decades of writing prose, poetry, fusion fiction, many genres?
Yes, yeah, interesting question, thank you. And thank you everybody for coming today, and it's absolutely wonderful to be in Jaipur for the first time. So in a way, I wasn't an overnight success, but I was also an overnight success, because literally my life was completely transformed from the evening of the Booker to the morning after the Booker, because suddenly everything I wanted for my career happened. And I found myself giving hundreds of interviews, even today, seriously, hundreds of interviews, talking about myself, and everybody was very interested in who I was, my background, where I'd come from, and so on. And yeah, so it's very interesting, because before I won the Booker, I was quite a private person. But afterwards, I found myself being very open about my life, which was, I don't understand that phenomenon, but suddenly I was much less guarded and reserved and private. So I was talking about myself a lot. And when it came to making a decision about the next book that I was going to publish with my publisher, who's Simon Prosser, at Hamish Hamilton, part of Penguin Random House, I've been with him over 20 years. And we were talking about it, and I thought, you know, I don't want to follow up this novel with another novel, because people will make comparisons, obviously, and there's going to be so much pressure attached to that. So I thought, why don't I write down what I've been talking about the last few years, which is about my life. But at the same time, I had never planned on writing an autobiography. I just thought, I know writers who have done this, and I just thought, how do you express 60 years at that stage, or 61 years of living in a book? Where do you begin? What do you leave out? And also, you're a private person, so there's lots of stuff that you are going to leave out. But then I thought, I'd like to write about my life in relationship to my creativity. And that felt like the perfect thing to do at that stage, because people can't compare a memoir with a novel. Nobody has come up to me and said, I thought your novel was better than your memoir, because you can't do that. So I kind of dodged that bullet. But I also then felt that I was, in talking about my life and my creativity, where I come from and all the sort of things I discuss in the book, which I'm sure we'll get into, I just thought it would illuminate for people on my background and my origin story. But it would also let people know that I really wasn't an overnight success. Because for most of my readers around the world, they only know of me through Girl, Woman, Other. But if you read the memoir, you know it goes back to 1959, right? Woolwich in southeast London, my parents, black and white, and everything else that's happened since. So I felt it would fill in the gaps. I would tell my story for myself, because that's the other thing when you're being interviewed. And when it's in the English language and you read the interviews, even for the best publications, they get things wrong. I just think, why don't you go onto my website? And then you will discover exactly how many books I've written. You will know where I was born, but they don't. I think sometimes journalism has got very shoddy. So there's lots of inaccuracy. So I thought, this is my truth, this is my perspective on my upbringing and my life, giving it to the world. And then I thought, I also want to be inspirational, because that's a big thing for me, right? To show people that you can be in the game a very long time before you reach the stage that I've reached. And that part of that is about continuing to do what you're doing and not giving up, which is why the title is, on not giving up. So those are all the things swirling about in my mind when I decided to write the book.
Just an aside, what's the worst thing a journalist has got wrong?
Evangelista. Oh. My name is, I have had many names, but Evangelista was pretty egregious. Everything you can think of, really, they've got wrong. And that's in English. I don't know about other languages.
So talking about your family background, it is very interesting. You are from a biracial family. You're 4 in a family. Siblings, you have 8 siblings. You were the middle one, and the middle ones tend to sort of be independent. They tend to kind of do things on their own. It was a very religious family. You went to confession very young, and you went to confession for very long. You have this interesting part where you mention about how, as a child, you haven't really sinned. So you end up making up confessions, or you end up making up sins. Do you think that was your early experience at storytelling?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Catholic Church. My mother was incredibly religious. My first school was a convent school run by nuns. This is before, the Catholic Church was put into disrepute, as it has been in more recent times. But nobody's asked me this question before. But it's true. So I can't remember what age I started going to confession, probably about 7 or 8. And you are supposed to, for anybody who doesn't know, you are supposed to, every Saturday morning, confess your sins. Right? What does that do to you as a child? So in the end, you know you haven't done anything wrong, so you make it up. You say, at the mildest level, you say, I had bad thoughts about one of my siblings. and you know, or I stole a sweet, or some other crime against humanity. So maybe that did trigger my imagination, because in a way you had to, well, actually that does many things to a child. It tells you that you're wrong, that you have inherent evil inside you, and that unless you go and confess to the extremely moralistic, as we now know, priest, then you're going to go to hell. So that was part of the my origin story, the creation myth of Christianity. You know, that if you're not a good person and confess your sins, and even then you still might go to hell.
You were a black family in a white neighborhood, and you talk about there were literally bricks thrown into your windows, and you weren't being metaphoric about that. You also mentioned how at this time in London, racism wasn't even a word that you had encountered. It was called prejudice. So can you talk us through a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things I do in the book is to explore how my family background shaped me as a person and as a writer, and how I grew up in this biracial family at a time in London when there weren't many of us, and it was in a very white area called Woolwich in southeast London, which is now the complete opposite. But at that time, my father literally was the only Nigerian in the village, and we were made to feel unwelcome. There was a lot of hostility, and my father was at the front end of that because he had arrived in Britain in 1949 when there were even fewer black people around, and he experienced the front line of really deep-rooted British racism that began with the racist justification of slave trade hundreds of years earlier. And so that was steeped into the British psyche as a whole. And so he experienced that, and then he marries my mother, who's a white English woman, and they have 8 children, which of course is also something that wasn't the case then, because British families were much smaller. And so we were like a carbuncle in the street and in the neighborhood. And we were made to feel that we weren't welcome. But there's also the other side to that, is that to a greater or lesser extent, we were also integrated. So it wasn't as if we were so isolated that we weren't able to have some kind of social life as children. My father was a very sociable person. He became a Labour councillor. He was very gregarious. He had loads of friends of all races. So on the one hand, we were living our lives as brown British people, but on the other hand, there was the underlying and sometimes very overt racism that we experienced. But that is the thing that I think shapes you more than anything else. And so I grew up feeling that I didn't belong, with a degree of self-hatred about my racialization, in the sense that as somebody who was called half-caste and later it's mixed race and now biracial, I didn't like my father, you know, I didn't like the color of my father's skin. So that was the internalized racism that I experienced as a child. And then by the time I was 18, 19, I went to a drama school where there were 5 of us, black women, and that was the beginning of my politicization as a black feminist. And that's when I claimed my black identity and also did all the research I needed to do into black and African history, and started to have a voice as a person who was, you know, proudly somebody black, or as we might say today, racialized as black. And that has influenced my writing ever since.
Talking about your father just sort of takes me to this quote. I have it and I'm going to read it out. With all of my books, I'm interested in where people come from in relationship to who they are. My father was Nigerian, but he didn't pass on anything about his history. They didn't in those days. You wanted your children to fit in order to survive. It's very important to know the alternatives to mainstream history, as we are not represented in it. To discover how deep our roots are is important. Those of us who are older are living history, and I feel we have a duty to share it. So can we talk about sort of the importance of alternatives to mainstream history, and also, which is a constant theme in all your books, I think.
That's right. So in all my works, I explore the African diaspora from multiple perspectives, sometimes very realistic, sometimes I create alternate universes. You know, and we also need to challenge, even though it's a term I use, this idea of mainstream history. because mainstream history for most of recorded history has actually been male history, right? Even women, 50% or so of the global population has been written out of what we call mainstream history. So actually, history, which is how we record the past happens and then we record it from particular perspectives, is actually very heterogeneous. It's about all of us, irrespective of our gender or sexuality or class or how we are racialized. And I'm sure I don't need to tell people here that the way in which British history has been recorded has been incredibly partial, right? There's been a very narrow perspective on British history, which actually continues right through to today. And certainly as a woman of colour growing up in Britain, we were invisible in the recording of its history. Even the transatlantic slave trade, with the foundations on which Britain's wealth was built for hundreds of years, is something that is not still, I don't think even today it's taught in British schools, let alone the empire. So my job as a writer, and it's actually also is my job, but it's also my joy, because I don't see these things as an ordeal, or I don't look at what I do from a negative perspective at all. I'm writing those narratives into being, exploring history in the ways that I want to, and bringing all those so-called alternative histories to life. And Black British history, which to be even more specific, we are a very small demographic in Britain, even smaller than the Asian population. And I think we do punch above our weight in many ways. We're very noisy. Sometimes I am anyway. But Black British history is something that most of the British population still isn't really conversant with. One of my books, The Emperor's Babe, which was published in 2001, is about a black girl whose parents come from ancient Nubia in the Sudan 1,800 years ago, and they arrive in Londinium, the capital of Roman Britain, and they give birth to Zuleika, who's their daughter, and it's about her life living in the Roman city. And so I wrote that book because I had read Staying Power by Peter Fryer, which some of you might know, the Black History of Britain in the 1980s. And he talks about a legion of Moors settling in Roman Britain at the beginning of the 3rd century AD. There was historical evidence for a legion of Moors from North Africa settling in Roman Britain in the 3rd century AD. And I remember when I read that, I was like, what does this come from? This is ridiculous. This is like nearly 2,000 years before we thought black people had arrived in Britain. So part of that job that I gave myself was to do the research, and have discovered that there has been a black presence in Britain off and on for at least 2,000 years, let alone early man arriving from the continent of Africa, right? Spreading out all over the world, including to Britain. So this book was about a black girl, imagining a black girl living in Roman London 1,800 years ago. And I create an alternate universe, so it's sort of historically correct, and it's also very imaginative with the truth. But the idea was to locate this presence in Roman London. And when the book was first published, I had been a writer in residence at the Museum of London. I was talking to the curators, and they said to me, oh, no, there were no black people in Roman London. And so I said, well, they were at Hadrian's Wall. We know that. There is the archaeological evidence for it. I said, yeah, but they didn't come to London. And I remember thinking, well, how do you know? You don't know. You don't know. You know, the Roman Empire, anyway, was multicultural, right? Rome, the city-state of Rome was multicultural. Why do you think they didn't come? They said there is no evidence for it. So shortly after the book was published, they used to have these guides who traveled around the museum and took people to the different displays and exhibition spaces, and they had a Roman gallery where you could walk through Roman rooms. So shortly after the book was published, they introduced a merchant's wife who was black. So I thought, brilliant, right? So I've opened your imagination to the fact that there could have been a black presence then. And then, probably 2 or 3 years later, they started to reinvestigate forensic remains of Roman London. And what did they discover? You know, with the developed science of 20-odd years ago, that there had been black people in Roman London, you know? So it was that myopia that they couldn't conceive of it. And I think that says something about British society, which is changing, I'm happy to say, that it's like there are these myths. The country is built on these myths of whiteness and, you know, and all other kinds of myths, which are not actually founded in reality. But people are so steeped in these myths, they can't imagine that actually it's not the whole story, right? And that's part of my project as a writer, and that's what I did with Girl, Woman, Other. You know, it was to open up the conversation around primarily black women, one character's non-binary, in Britain, going back over 140 years, I think, because I wanted to just position us as we have been positioned in this country in an imaginative, fictional way.
Sorry, digging to Girl, Woman, Other, because it's just a brilliant book, and I know the session is about Manifesto, but I do have one question about it. To those of you who haven't read it, it's incredible because it has very little punctuation, or it has very innovative punctuation. So there limited full stops and very few capital letters to denote the start of a sentence. But I think because of that, the characters really leap off the page. And you find that you're reading and you can't really stop because you're just going from character to character. And it's fascinating. So it's these 12 women, or 11 women and one, I think, non-binary character. And it's their stories and there's sort of some connections to it. You've called it fusion fiction. So can we talk about that term a little bit? And were you ever tempted to kind of do a memoir in an equally innovative form?
Yeah, no, not for the memoir. It's not actually such a creative project, writing a memoir. It's very interesting because you have to write the truth as you perceive it. When you come from a family of 8, everyone's got their own version of your childhood. That's why I have to say that, right? And I know that we all have our own slant on the past. But the fusion fiction, actually, and I do talk about it in Manifesto, so there is a relationship. I talk about my process as a writer and how when I started writing initially for theatre in 1979, 1980, when I was a drama student, and how I was writing poetry. So I was creating poetry drama, and it was very experimental, and that was because I found that I couldn't fit what I wanted to explore in theatre, which at that stage was black women's lives, into any of the traditional British, so-called kind of European theatre forms. I found that I needed to be unfettered from those forms. And then through my various books, and I do talk in the book, in Manifesto, about how I created these forms. So I went from a poetry collection to a verse novels, to a novel with verse, which is my most formally experimental novel, and so on and so forth, until I got to Go With Another. So I had this foundation of 40 years of experimenting. And the form I use in Go Woman Other, what I call a fusion fiction, is a form that I used in the previous book, Mr. Loverman. So there were two main characters of Mr. Loverman, Barrington, who's a 74-year-old gay man, and Carmel, his wife. And I used that form for his wife. And I thought I really liked the form because it was a very free-flowing writing experience. What I discovered was that if you take away the full stop, you are not stopped. The creative process is not stopped. So it was very free-flowing in the writing of the book. But when I say that, people think, oh, so that's how you write a book. You just don't have any full stops and you just write. But you have to be very disciplined and structured in terms of how you do that, because otherwise it's just going to be a sprawling mess. But I did find in the first and second draft that free-flowing writing experience allowed me to just charge ahead with the story and to have these 12 characters. It also allowed me, because it's a kind of poetic form, although I don't call it poetry really, as some people do, that allowed me to cover huge swathes of time in as few words as possible. So each character has 30 pages, but you feel like you know the story of their life. If I had written it in the prose form, it would have read as, I think, 12 short stories, and it would have been very contained and restrained within the form. But without having those full stops and having what I call a pro-poetic patterning on the page, it allowed me to be more expansive than I would have been. And so, like you said, and you were reading it, that you just can't stop. So that's also, you know, it's almost like the reader can't stop because you haven't given them the full stop. And so I really understood at a very deep level what a full stop meant through getting rid of most of them. And then it was the redrafting that was a nightmare. Because even though I was writing this format of a foundation of 40-odd years of writing, it was also a bit of a sprawling mess. So then trying to discipline it probably took me about 3 years and some help to try and work out the structure. And so getting back to Manifesto, I talk about that process and how I learned the hard way how to write my books. But learning the hard way is also the slow way. So one of my previous books, Lara, which is a fictionalized version of my family history, that took me 5 years, but I spent 3 years trying to write a traditional novel. It didn't work. And then I spent 2 years turning it into a novel in verse, and it worked. But I had to spend those three years before I could get to the form that worked for it. Now, I know a lot of writers, and I've been around literature a very long time, and I don't think this is an issue with most writers I know. They start a novel in one form, and it ends up in that form. And often they're quite formulaic in terms of how they write the book. Whereas with me, several of my books have ended up in different forms to the form I originally began the book in.
So I think in Manifesto, it comes out very clearly about how writing is hard work. And you talk about how often, I think you had a 90,000-word manuscript that became a 45,000 one. And so when your students sort of crib about rewriting 2,000 words, you give them a little bit of a smirk. And you've spent years doing this. And like you said, the last book took 5 years. So can we talk about the hard work of writing? And then where's the enjoyment?
Yes, well, it is enjoyable. I do also know writers who say, oh my God, I suffer, it's so painful writing. And I'm like, listen, there are many writers out there, we don't need you. You know, you really don't have to write these books if you're suffering so much, right? Because for us, it's a vocation. And there should be deep rewards involved in the process, not just in the product, but in the process. And for me, it does take hard work, but it's enjoyable hard work. And sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating. Sometimes I'm working on a book, like with Girl, Woman, Other, I got to a stage where I never get to the well, I have got to the stage, that's not true, where I have actually ditched something. But I didn't get to that stage with that book. But, you know, it's like, oh my God, it's so challenging trying to work through the issues that are being thrown up as you're working on the fiction. And that can be frustrating. And sometimes my process has been almost intentionally painful. So sometimes, as a writer, I've gone into the pain of my characters in order to be able to produce that. And that's, I think, just having a very deep emotional connection with my characters so that it feels really credible and authentic. But yeah, the hard work is, first of all, believing that you have a right to do this. And, you know, there are certain individuals who are born into backgrounds where becoming a writer is entirely feasible for them. They're surrounded by literature. Maybe their parents are a writer. They come from a certain culture where books are very much part of their life. So the first thing is self-confidence and self-belief. Then it's finding your own way of doing something. So sometimes my students and other people say to me, what's, you know, how do you work? What do you, you know, what's your process? And I will share my process, but they have to find their own process. And finding your own process is also challenging. So as I've said, you know, all the different forms and many years working on some books. Girl, Woman, Other took over 5 years. Lara took 5 years. Soul Tourist took 4 years, you know. And I do know writers who will write books in 3 months and write bestsellers, right? So you're also comparing yourself to those people who write very, very quickly and very productively and very commercially successfully. So that is also the hard work and the challenge. And then it's I want my books to be original. I want every book that I write to be very different to the ones that have gone before. And so I set that standard for myself, and that isn't always the case with every writer. Some people mind their own lives, and they're very open about doing that. And then it's the quality of the writing. because my background is in poetry for theatre, my first book was a poetry book, it's about crafting the language so that it is as it needs to be. And that means many, many, many revisions. So I revise every line, every paragraph, if there are paragraphs, every page, every section, multiple times, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times, before I reach a first draft. And then some of the books will go through 3, 4, 5 drafts before it's absolutely polished. And that is enjoyable, but it is very hard work. You know, you do have to have stamina. Well, I have to have stamina to write the books that I write. Yeah.
I think I want to take you to one of your earliest works. It was what you wrote for stage, The N-Word.
Oh, yeah.
And it was an explosion of rage. I think that's how you describe it. So over the years, how has your rage changed?
Oh.
So, maybe you could tell the audience what the play was about.
To call it a play is very grand. I was a drama student, and it was a very pithy poem, probably consisting of about 10 words. And it was called, I think I called it Nigger. Do I talk about it? I must talk about it in the book, don't I? Oh, you heard me mention it, yes. And it was just called Nigger, and it was just this performance piece, and it was, you know, very crude and raw, I have to say. But I was angry at society's injustices as a young woman in my early 20s. I was definitely an angry woman. I had grown up and I was starting to understand the political context of my childhood and the racism that we endured, but also the way society was structured and how, as black women and Asian women, actually going back to the late 70s, early 80s, if not up to today, although it's different now, you know, you are seen as nobody was interested in what we were doing. You were so marginalized, you were invisible. Literally, there was zero interest in your creativity, in your politics, in what you have to say. And Britain's first black woman member of parliament, Diane Abbott, didn't happen until about, I think, 1985, 86. And she was the first. I don't know who the second was, but I think that was some time after. So I was angry at that. I'd become a feminist. And there is lots to be angry about as a feminist. But I think if you continue to nurture your anger, you will self-immolate, right? It will burn you out. So by the time I reached the end of my 20s, 30s, I turned that anger, and I know it sounds really smug, I turned it into energy. That anger became energy. And that's what I feed off today. So I did a public event with somebody I'd been at drama school with, and we were both angry together. And I hadn't seen her for like 40 years. And I did an event, and she put her hand up, and she said, you know, what do you do with your anger? You know, blah, blah, blah. And I could tell this woman was still angry 40 years later. And I said what I've said to you, anger, energy. And she looked at me as if I'd betrayed the cause. You know, how can you say that? And I thought, oh my God, you're so angry. And I wanted to speak to her afterwards because I wanted to know what she'd done with her life. Because I thought, how can you, you know, surely that's going to make you unhappy. You're hurting yourself if you're living with such rage and anger. But actually, energy is a very positive force that you can nurture within yourself, and that positive force gives you energy to get on and do the work that you have to do.
Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Okay. I think we just have about 5, maybe 2 questions, 1 question. Any hands? Oh, we have 10 minutes. Ah, okay. Okay. Front.
Bernardine, you must talk more about poetry, because it's really your foundational brickwork. Of course, drama is part of it, but poetry includes drama. And then also for the audiences in India, especially, your literary activism, because that needs to happen in many other parts of the world.
So, hi, Sudeep. So we first met in 1994. We were the same publisher, People Tree Press, and it was my first collection. And that's how long I've known you. It's nearly 30 years, blimey. So yeah, poetry is the foundation for my writing. And I think the main thing is that when I've tried to go away from my poetic voice, I have failed. There was a time when, and even though I'm very strong in my creative practice and I had been an experimental writer, but there was a time when I thought, maybe I should try and write like Ian McEwan. I just thought, and you know, I'm admitting this to you, but I just thought, because that's what people like. They like that, his sensibility, they like his effortlessly elegant prose. It's very British. And whenever I've gone down that path, it's led to disaster because I lose my poetic voice. But my practice is in poetry. One of the things I talk about in Manifesto is that actually the good side of growing up in the Catholic Church is that I was inundated with the language of the Bible from the age of 5. I went to Mass every day at my primary school for the first 4 years of my education, which was the convent. I went to church every Sunday, probably from the age of 6 or so, until I was 15, no, I think it's 5, until I was 15. And if anybody knows what the Catholic Mass is like, the language is very Rococo, right? So actually, I was steeped in poetic language from my earliest years. And so when I started writing for theatre and it came out as poetry, I didn't realize it was because of the church. I only realized that relatively recently, that of course the poetry came out because I had absorbed it through osmosis for such a long time in my most formative years. And then the theatre background also, you know, studying Shakespeare, performing Shakespeare, was also an engagement with poetry at a very deep level. Because if you're performing poetry through drama, then you are absorbing it into your DNA in a way. Very different to just reading it as an intellectual exercise. And that's what I had also been doing in my teenage years. So that poetry just came through. So the activism is something that, you know, the first theatre company I co-founded, Theatre of Black Women, we would probably call that an activist theatre company today. We never really used that expression then, but it was to create theatre for and by black women, and that included Asian women, because Asian people were, you know, not everybody, but a lot of Asian people, politicized Asian people, came under the umbrella of black in the 1980s. I don't think that's quite the same now. And so forming the theatre company was about giving ourselves a platform and a voice in society. And then ever since then, I have created various projects that have been activist projects around literature. One of the projects is something called The Complete Works, which ran for 10 years. And it was a mentoring scheme that I initiated to bring poets of colour through in the British literary landscape, because I initiated a report which the Arts Council produced, which discovered that under 1% of poetry books in Britain were written, published poetry books in Britain were written by black and Asian people. And I knew this, but they needed to do the report to find the statistics. And so the report was produced, and it got some attention. Then I thought, well, this will go the way of other reports. Nobody will do anything. So I thought, okay, I'm going to set up a mentoring scheme and bring on poets this way. And so the Arts Council funded this scheme for 10 years, and we brought on 30 poets with origins all over Africa and Asia, and they are now many of Britain's leading poets. That was an incredibly successful scheme, and they were mentored for 1 or 2 years by some of Britain's leading poets, and also networked into the poetry scene, because it was a very white and not always very welcoming poetry scene for writers of colour. And they've won every award going, the leading top awards. And so it's very heartening to think that you have a seed of an idea, you have a little bit of cultural capital, you go to the funders, they fund a project, and it kind of starts to change the scene. Likewise with another project I set up called the Brunel International African Poetry Prize, which was to bring African poets to the fore on the international landscape because there were very few African poets getting published abroad. And this scheme ran for 10 years. It's now been taken on by Kwame Dawes, mutual friend, at the University of Nebraska, and he's called it the Evaristo African Poetry Prize. So I'm no longer running it, but for 10 years we had this prize, and it would go to 1, 2, or 3 poets a year. There would be a financial reward. My university, Brunel University, funded it. And those poets, likewise, are out there publishing books, doing incredibly well. So these are 2 of the schemes that I think have been very successful, and they're actually very easy to do. It doesn't, you just have to manage your time in terms of, and bring on the right people as well to help manage the project. So the Complete Works, I initiated it, I was an advisor, somebody else called Natalie Teitler ran it for 10 years, funded by the Arts Council. You just have to have these ideas and then put them into practice and then see that there is a ripple effect, and that without these schemes, the poetry scene will not change. It just simply will not change because, in a sense, we're just too minoritized. But now you have also Black and Asian people who are poetry editors. Kayo Chingonyi is poetry editor at Bloomsbury. One of his writers has just won the T.S. Eliot Prize, One of the mentees, Sarah Howe, won the T.S. Eliot Prize. Mona Archie won the Forward Prize. It's having a ripple effect that will become part of the foundations of the literature culture, so that it isn't just a trend. So everybody needs to pass on. They need to pass on and make sure that everybody has the opportunities that have been denied many of us throughout history.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more? Okay, one more question. Anybody? Yeah, sure.
Hi. Thank you so much, Bernardine and Nandini, for that conversation. I wanted to ask you if your relationship with the Catholic Church ever came in the way of your writing queer and non-binary characters. And if it did, how did you negotiate both those things in your life?
I don't think so, not really. I think I've reacted against well, actually no, maybe not. But I think I got rid of the limiting philosophy of the Catholic Church a very long time ago. And certainly it wasn't part of my thinking with the non-binary character. It just felt really important that I would create these 12 characters, that one of them should be trans in some way, and that they should also be on the queer spectrum, as I put it, that they shouldn't be all heterosexual characters. And they are, probably a quarter are queer on the queer spectrum, and that was just very, very important. But I don't think there was a direct correlation with the Catholic Church.
Thank you. One more? Okay. Great. There's a hand in front. Oh, sorry. There's someone here.
Yeah, thank you. So, writing a memoir, there's so much reflection that comes in with it. Is there anything that, as you were in that writing process of your own life story, that surprised you? Something that you were like, oh, I didn't realize that this was an important moment, or I didn't realize the impact this would have until I started writing in this process?
Yeah, I think you do learn. I think when you write a memoir, you are learning about yourself, because you're having to interrogate your past, but also find a way to articulate it and frame it. And that's not something you do when you just have a past. And, even if you tell people about your past, various aspects of your past. So I did learn about myself, and I was surprised at myself. So I was in a very controlling relationship in my 20s. And it's something I talk about a lot. I would dine out on it. Do you know what I mean? Because people are fascinated. But actually, I really felt the impact of that relationship on my life through writing about my life from my childhood onwards. And I was like, oh my God, you know, because I was what I considered to be a strong feminist, ending up handing my power over to somebody else, complicit in handing my power to somebody else. So that was a learning thing. And I also learnt about my family origins, because I know, you know, shortly before the book was written, I discovered that on my mother's side, we can track her family line on one side back 300 years in Britain. So that was really interesting, but also thinking about how I am a child of migration, which isn't something I'd thought at in any depth. So my father was Nigerian, but his father had come over from Brazil, part of the freed slave movement from Brazil to West Africa. My mother was Irish and German and English. And just thinking about how you are somebody who is the result of people who travel from one country to another, one continent to another, often to very hostile environments, especially if they were coming to Britain 100 or so, or 150 years ago. And I was thinking, you know, we inherit from the people that we knew, our family, whether we acknowledge it or not, but we also inherit from those that we don't know, because things are passed on. Things are passed on. So I was thinking how some of my strength and resilience, does that not come from these people who were my ancestors who I didn't know personally? So that was I mean, that might be seen as quite fanciful, but I think there is a kernel of truth in that. So that was an interesting observation.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're all out of time. Thanks so much for being here, Bernardine. Thank you for the audience. I can see there's a line already for book signing.
Yes, yes. Thank you. And how fascinating is it that you start your memoirs in poetry? It reminded me of Indian classic scriptures, Indian classic writing. Thank you so much, Bernardine, and thank you, Nandini. She's very happy to sign her books. The book signing counter, you can see right over there. And please. A mark of respect and a token of love from all of us at the festival. Thank you, Bernardine. Thank you, Nandini. Thank you. Thank you, audiences. Please help us keep the venue very neat and clean. And please keep a track of your personal belongings. The festival will not be able to be liable or responsible for that. And at the same time, in any case, if somebody needs a medical help, the medical desk is right outside as alongside our festival information desk. It's at the entrance of the lobby of the hotel, right outside Charbagh. Thank you.